Hello, and welcome to Business Law 431, the Law of Commercial Transactions. I'm Professor Hunt, and I'll be your instructor. Throughout this semester, I'll be posting these videos, which consist of lectures over the material from the chapters. As we go along, if you ever have a problem or a question about any of the material in one of these lectures, please don't hesitate to contact me. Let's get started with our first chapter, Chapter 10, Introduction to Contracts. As with most things, we want to start at the beginning. And in the beginning of contracts is the definition of the term contract. The term contract is a term of art in the law. It has a specific meaning. On the slide, you can see I put the definition as a contract is a promise that the law will enforce. As we go through this semester, I'll mention that not all promises that people make are enforceable by law. Those that are, we consider contracts. Contracts are binding and enforceable agreements that a court will enforce. How do we know if we have one? Well, sometimes this is an issue for the court. And the court, in order to determine if we have a valid contract, breaks it down into 4 elements. And we have the basic elements there on the screen. A contract consists of these 4 basic elements. 1, an agreement. We'll find out later as we discuss an agreement in more detail that an agreement consists of an offer and an acceptance. 2nd, consideration. 3rd, legality. And 4th, capacity. We'll be discussing each of these elements in turn as we go along. Some people like to add a 5th element, that of format or form. This usually involves the question of whether the contract is in writing or needs to be in writing or what format it's in. And we'll be discussing that too, but I like to focus on these 4 basic elements as we go forward. Let's take a look at the court's role in enforcing a contract. As I mentioned, a contract is a promise the law will enforce. Well, the law enforces contracts through its court system. And sometimes judges have different philosophies on how to enforce contracts or whether to enforce contracts. And we can break these philosophies down into 2 schools of thoughts or 2 camps. On one side, we have the judges who follow the judicial restraint school of thought. Judicial restraintists are judges who are reluctant to alter the party's agreement and will enforce its terms regardless of the foolishness of the deal or maybe the harshness of the terms of the deal. This, of course, makes the law more predictable but less flexible. On the other hand, we have judges who are judicial activists. These are judges who may ignore certain parts of an agreement or the entire agreement altogether if it would be unfair or unjust to enforce its terms. This makes the law more flexible but less predictable. Judges usually try to strike a balance between predictability on one hand and flexibility on the other hand when enforcing contracts. Let's take a look now at the types of contracts. Contracts are put into categories a lot of the times, and so we have a lot of those categories listed here in the next few slides. The first distinction I want to make is between what we call bilateral and unilateral contracts. A bilateral contract is a contract where both parties make a promise to do something in the future. Some people refer to this as a promise in exchange for a promise. If I promise to come mow your lawn next Saturday for $50 in exchange for your promise to pay me $50, then we have a bilateral contract. We have exchanged promises to perform in the future, a promise in exchange for a promise. That is as opposed to a unilateral contract. A unilateral contract is where one party makes a promise that the other party can only accept by performing. This is a promise in exchange for an action. The offer for a unilateral contract is phrased differently than the bilateral contract. If I were going to make a unilateral contract offer, I might say something like this. I will pay $50 to the first person who can bring me a vanilla latte from the Dividends Cafe in Stipes Hall, which, by the way, I hereby revoke that offer. It's no longer valid or enforceable, so don't do that. The only way that that offer can be accepted and a contract created is by performing that action. In other words, by being the first person who could bring me the latte. If you were the first person who brought me the latte, then I would be obligated to pay you the $50. It's a promise of payment in exchange for your action, being the first one to do it. Our next categories of contracts are express and implied contracts. Express contracts are those we normally think of. This is where the parties express to each other ahead of time what their performance will be. I promise to come mow your lawn next Saturday for $50. In exchange, you promise to pay me $50. We have expressed ahead of time what our performance will be. I will mow, provide mowing services, and you will pay, payment of money. And that's normally how we think of most contracts. However, courts do recognize and enforce contracts that aren't expressed. In fact, courts will enforce implied contracts from time to time. In other words, a court will imply the existence of a contract through the actions of the parties. Right? And on the screen here we can see an implied contract has three basic elements. Number one, that the plaintiff furnishes some property or services to the defendant. Second, that the plaintiff expected to be paid and the defendant knew this. And last, that the defendant had a chance to reject the service but didn't. Let me give you an example of the type of an implied contract that most of us enter into all the time without really thinking of it as an implied contract. I don't know how many of you have purchased gasoline from a self-service gas station in the last week or so. But most of us are familiar with that type of transaction. If I go to a gas station, the local Casey's convenience store, and I fill up my car with gas, if I don't pay for the gas and I drive away, do you think Casey's could sue me for the value of the gas? Of course they could. Also, by the way, that's a crime. Don't do that, right? But yes, they could sue me for the value of the gas that I took. Well, on what legal theory? On the legal theory that we entered into a contract, gasoline, in exchange for money. And this is true even where we didn't speak to one another. We didn't express to each other ahead of time what our performance would be. In fact, that would be pretty odd in our society today. If I went into the Casey's convenience store ahead of time before I put the gas in my car and I made them a legal offer, and I said to the person behind the counter, I hereby offer to pay you, $2.05 per gallon of gasoline, with a limit of 20 gallons of gasoline. Do you accept? If the person behind the counter heard me say that, they would probably say, yeah, sure, right? That would be an express contract, but we don't need to do that. Instead, we can imply through our actions that we intended to form a contract. When I pull up to the pump and put the gas in my car, anybody looking at my actions can imply that I wanted to form a contract to purchase the gasoline. Actually, if we run that example through our elements here, we can see that it meets all the elements. The first element of an implied contract is the plaintiff furnishes some property or services. And the plaintiff in my example is Casey's. So, did Casey's furnish some property or services? Yes, gasoline. Second, the plaintiff expected to be paid. Does Casey's expect to be paid for their gasoline? Absolutely. And that the defendant, that's me in the example, knew that they expected to be paid. Now, how could I be expected to know that Casey's wants to be paid for their gasoline? Well, it may have to do with the 20-foot tall sign with the price on it, right? Plus, you can't reasonably live in our society and expect to get something from a business for profit for nothing. So, yes, I could reasonably be expected to know that Casey's wanted to be paid for their gas. And last, did I have a chance to reject the service or the product, the gasoline in this case, but didn't and took advantage of it? Well, of course. I was the one that pulled into the convenience store and put the gas in my car. It's not like someone from Casey's, snuck into my garage late at night and put the gas into my car without asking me. So, as we see, we can run that example through the elements of an implied contract and tell that, yes, we did have a contract, even though neither I nor Casey spoke to one another and expressed our intentions ahead of time. The next category for contracts that we're going to look at is an easy one. This is an easy distinction to make. This is the difference between executory and executed contracts. The first category, executory contracts, this is when a contract is made but not all the parties have fulfilled their obligations. I like to say an executory contract is one that's not finished yet. One or both parties still have something left to perform. Executed, on the other hand, is a completed contract. This is where all the parties have completed their performance. So, executory and executed, we could just say finished or not finished. Now, this will become important later on, especially when we talk about the statute of frauds and we start to mention executory contracts. But for now, just understand that these are terms, labels that we give contracts. Executory, not finished yet, and executed, finished. And next we have our unenforceable agreements. And I want to make a distinction here between void and voidable because the law does. Our first category here is voidable contracts. The law permits one party to terminate one of these voidable agreements, but not both of them. And I've given you some examples of what creates a voidable contract here: fraud or lack of capacity of one of the parties, like one of the parties being a minor, which we'll talk about later. In the instance of fraud or contracting with a minor, this creates a voidable contract, which means it's capable of being voided by one side. For instance, in a contract with a minor, between an adult and a minor, the contract is voidable at the option of the minor and can be avoided, right? But if the minor wants to keep a contract and enforce it against the adult, then it's not automatically void. Our next category is void, right? Void is where neither party can enforce the contract. And I've given you some examples there. This is where you have a contract, the subject matter of which is illegal, or which one party had no authority to make in the first place. Obviously, a contract for illegal behavior is not enforceable. No court is going to enforce an illegal contract. In fact, this always reminds me, several years ago in Macomb, we had a case where two local workers at a factory contracted with one another, where one of the workers contracted with the other to kill his wife. It was a literal contract on the life of his wife, and he was going to pay him, I think it was somewhere around $2,000, which I thought was shockingly low. But anyway, the contract was, you kill my wife, I'll pay you $2,000. Now, obviously, no court is going to enforce that as a valid contract. That's void because the subject matter of that contract is murder, right, which is highly illegal. One thing to note about void contracts too there is that neither party can enforce the contract. So if the one worker decided to go out and kill the spouse and did actually perform that and then didn't get paid, he couldn't sue for the $2,000, clearly. Okay, this next slide, I just wanted to make a chart to let you know kind of which categories are opposed to one another. So you can see here we have bilateral versus unilateral contracts. So you can't have at the same time a bilateral contract and a unilateral contract. It's one or the other. Bilateral, remember, means a promise for a promise. Unilateral means a promise for an action. So you can't have both of those. Our next category is express versus implied contracts. You either have an expressed contract, where the party's performance is expressed to each other ahead of time, or you have a contract that's implied in the actions of the party, but not both. Now, one important thing to note about this slide, and the reason that I put it out here, is because you can have a bilateral expressed contract. As between the categories, as we proceed down the slide, there's no mutual exclusion. So, in fact, you can have a bilateral expressed contract that is executory, right? So there's no prohibition between categories as we go down the slide, only as we go horizontally. So you can't have a bilateral and unilateral contract. You can't have an expressed and an implied contract. You can't have a contract that's executory and executed, which means not finished yet and finished at the same time. And then down here at the bottom, I want to just take a second and explain these terms. We can have a valid contract. Those are the ones that we think of that are valid and enforceable. We can have an unenforceable contract. Now, this I didn't mention, but we call a contract unenforceable if there's some sort of legal defense that would prevent a court from enforcing it. Later on, we'll talk about whether contracts have to be in writing or not. And there's a certain law called the statute of frauds that does require certain categories of contracts to be in writing. Well, if you have a contract that is required to be in writing and it's not in writing, Then we have what we call an unenforceable contract. It's not void because the subject matter is legitimate, but it may be unenforceable because of a legal defense, like the statute of frauds or the statute of limitations if we wait too long to enforce it, or one of those defenses. And then the remaining categories: voidable, like we mentioned, voidable, which means capable of being voided, like by a minor or by someone that lacks mental capacity, and then void. Void contracts are those that are illegal or without authority, and of course are never enforceable by anyone.